Today we're going to look at a store that changed the way that we view shopping or the way that we shop in general. Now, you might be wondering, why are we talking about shopping at the museum? Well, it's the museum's job not only to talk about the tangible history or the artifacts that we have, but also the intangible history or the things that we can't touch or see, but have affected society as time has gone on. And one of those is shopping. Now, you might be wondering, how has shopping affected us? Well, you're in the right place because that is what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we go into the history of what stores were like and what the shopping experience was like, I want to think about what the shopping experience is like today. We have those big stores where you can walk in and get groceries, clothes, and batteries all at the same time. For example, Superstore, Walmart, and of course Costco. But if you didn't want to go into the stores, no worries, because we have Amazon. The online shopping experience now lets you sit in the comfort of your home with your pajamas and big fluffy bunny slippers on, and all you have to do is walk to your front door to receive your purchase. Now, these are all common luxuries that we experience in our shopping experience today. But this wasn't always the case. Prior to 1869, we had stores that really specialized in a specific area. Now, that would be like the shoe store. They only sold shoes there. The seamstress and tailors, they only sold clothing. We would have hat stores that specifically sold hats. And then we'd also have our bakeries that would only sell baked goods. And that's because that these guys that owned these stores, they were really good at the trade that they were in. So they were really good at making dresses, but the tailor couldn't make shoes like a shoemaker could. So that is why the stores were very much specialized up to this time. Now, of course, you would have like a dry goods store, which would have a different variety of objects like shovels and string, but for the most part, most stores specialized in a specific consumer good, and that is what they sold. Another thing to note is the way that they did business. So today we get our goods, pay the price, and head on our way. Back then, they would barter the prices. So the consumer brought goods in to trade and they used credits instead of cash. And so they would go back and forth and try and find a fair price for the good that they brought in, how much credit they would get, and then they'd again get, if they wanted the cheese, they would again have to barter to see what price they could get the cheese for. And this took a lot of time, especially if you like to barter and you wanted to get the best price you could get for you and your family. You would continue to barter until you felt you got the best price. So now that you kind of understand what the shopping experience was like back then, you may be able to understand why society thought that Timothy Eaton was a madman for his store policies. Now, a lot of these were kind of out and about already. He maybe didn't invent them himself, but he implemented them. And that in itself is an innovation because not a lot of stores were implementing these. In fact, pretty much none of them were. And so that's why Timothy Eaton is so innovative in the shopping experience. And some of those are things that we take for granted today, like fixed prices. He saw that the consumer and the employees were wasting a lot of time bartering back and forth. So he introduced fixed prices so that when you came in, you knew what that price was going to be and it was the same across the board for everyone. Because of this, he had price tags to indicate what the prices of different goods were. He also introduced cash only. And everyone knew if you went into Eaton's store, you'd have to pay cash. And if you didn't want to pay cash, you'd have to go do your business somewhere else. But with this, he also introduced a money back guarantee. And for this, he was like, if you're not satisfied whatsoever, bring it back, we'll give you your money back. He also introduced department stores. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but really this is where we see not really the specialization stores anymore, but specialization within one bigger store. We also get the mail order, and we'll talk more about this later as well. So Who is this Timothy Eaton I keep referring to? Well, Timothy Eaton was born in Ireland to Scottish Protestant parents, and he apprenticed at a general store in Ireland under Mr. Smith. Timothy came to Canada with his two older brothers in 1854. Here he worked at a small general store in Glen Williams. When he realized there wasn't enough money in it for him, he moved to Kirkton and ran a general country store and post office. He then partnered with James and Robert, his older brothers, in St. Mary's, and they ran a grocery and dry goods store. Now, this partnership did not last very long, and they decided to mutually split, with Robert getting the grocery and James and Timothy getting the dry goods store. Now, James and Timothy worked together from 1860 to 1868. Now, while Timothy was in St. Mary's, he got attached to the Methodist Church. And this is important because this is really where he decided he was going to base his business values off of. So he based them off of David in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament. And he was attached to this Methodist church until the day he died. Here he also met his wife, Margaret. In 1862 to 1863, they got married. And she was very helpful in the business. She was a good judge of character, and she was very hands-on in helping Timothy if he needed any help. Together they would have 8 kids. But they moved to Toronto in 1868, and for the first year he partnered with Mr. Allison in the wholesale dry goods business. But in 1869 he bought Mr. Jennings' retail business at the corner of Yonge and Queen Street for $6,500, and this really is the birth of the T. Eaton Company. Well, this was the store that Timothy really introduced the fixed prices, price tags, cash only, and money back guarantees. And he had a saying, goods satisfactory or money refunded, and this policy was implemented in 1870. And he did really good for himself. By 1882, he had expanded along Yonge Street, and he had a 4-floor building, which included elevators and electrical lights. In 1884, Timothy Eaton introduced the idea of catalogs, and he introduced this because he realized he was reaching the people in the city, but he wasn't quite reaching the people out in the country because the people in the country couldn't get to his store all the time. So he introduced the catalog so that they could see the goods, order in by mail what they wanted, and then they would ship the goods back out to them. And this was so successful that they even built a mail order building in 1903 to meet the demands of how many orders they were getting. And with freight becoming more accessible, like with the railway expanding and the use of cars now, Eaton's was able to provide free shipping on orders over $25. And it was this idea that really fueled Eaton's expansion and success. So seeing that his store was very popular and the catalogs were very successful, Mr. Eaton found a way to reduce the distance between the factory and the consumer, eliminating the wholesaler entirely. And that was to build his own factory. So he built his own factory in 1889, and this ended up reducing the prices for the consumers because they eliminated the middleman. Now, this idea came from a salesman who was making special size curtains for consumers. Eventually, this idea kept growing upon itself, and they started making them in the store, but it got so big and so in demand that Mr. Eaton built his own factory. Seeing that he had great success in Toronto, he then decided to open a store in Winnipeg. Now, this store opened in 1905 and was managed by John Craig Eaton, his son. This would be the last expansion that Timothy Eaton would see. In 1907, he passed away of pneumonia. His son, John Craig Eaton, would then take over Eaton's business. And what John Craig really worked on was the expansion of distribution centers. So from 1916 to 1920, there would be distribution centers in Moncton, Regina, and Saskatoon. Unfortunately, John Craig Eaton died in 1922 from influenza.
So then Robert Young Eaton would take over the business as John's son was too young, and Robert Young Eaton was Timothy's nephew. Under Robert's leadership, he would expand so that the department stores were seen in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and Quebec, specifically in Montreal, which there's a picture here of a postcard of the Montreal Eaton's department store. The other photographic images would be from Calgary's store. Their influence was so great on the shopping experience, they even included dining rooms to bring the fine dining of England over here into Canada. So they had the Gregorian room, which is the room on the bottom that you can see the advertisement for, and the round room, which is the circular room. Now, the Gregorian room was introduced in 1924 and the round room in 1930. And as I said, this was to bring the fine dining experience to the shoppers, and it was to elevate their shopping experience. Now, these images depict the department store in Toronto from around 1927 to 1999, and you can see in the bottom picture that it includes the store, the mail order building, as well as the factory. Little fun fact, in 1930, Eaton's had 25,000 employees and controlled 60% of department store sales in Canada. Another fun fact is that Eaton's had a department store in every province by 1957. Now, Timothy Eaton was very community-minded. In his small community of his employees, he was known for taking care of them. For example, he would send nurses when they were sick, extend their lunch breaks so that they could go home and eat a decent meal, and he would also help some of them buy their homes. For the more broader community, he held the Santa Day Parade. Now, this started in 1905 in Toronto, and he tried to keep the commercialization to a minimal, but of course, a parade of that size and magnitude was still very effective in advertising for Eaton's. The costumes and the floats were all made by Eaton's and were displayed along a mile-long route. Now, this was so successful that they started one in Winnipeg in 1909 and another one in Montreal in 1925. Now, Winnipeg's ended in 1965, Montreal's ended in 1969 due to the FLQ bombings and they just never picked it back up, and Toronto's ended in 1982 for financial reasons. Now, it's important to note that other organizations have picked up on the parade, and so the parades are still happening, they're just not sponsored by Eaton's. Now, John Craig Eaton, he was very influential during the war, specifically World War I, and he helped ensure that his employees who were on active war service received their full pay. He also contributed to the war by purchasing a bunch of armored cars, and because of these efforts, he was actually knighted. So Sir John created a Boys and Girls Club that offered recreational and educational facilities for his employees and their families. So both John Craig Eaton and Timothy Eaton were very community-minded and made a lot of contributions to the community. Unfortunately, August 1999 was the start of the end of an era. Eaton's declared bankruptcy, and Sears ended up taking over their buildings. So why is it important to discuss Eaton's, especially when Timothy Eaton was in Toronto, and he found his success largely in Ontario? How does it apply to us here in Whitewood? Well, Timothy Eaton changed the shopping experience. His implementation of these innovative ideas has helped shape and influence the way that we shop today. Now, back in the day, Regina had an Eaton's. Now, some of you may remember it, but others of you, like myself, may not remember it. And we can see the influence and effect that it has had here in Whitewood just based on the artifacts that we have. So the history of shopping is a little bit intangible, something that we can't touch. But we can make it tangible by looking at artifacts that we have here in the museum. For example, in the bottom picture, this is from a sewing machine that has Timothy Eaton's company's logo on it. We also have in the pink frame an Eaton's exercise book that would have been used in the school. And in the light blue picture frame we have on the back of a picture that I was working with, it was framed at an Eaton's department store in the picture department. Now, these are all small things in life, but it shows kind of the broader effect upon society that Eaton's had. We have quite the collection of Eaton's catalogs here at the museum. Now, these have played a culturally significant role in Canadians' lives. Now, if you don't believe me, maybe you can relate it back to the Sears catalog. Now, Sears has gone out of business, so some of you may not have this experience. But for me personally, I remember every year around Christmas time, we'd get the Christmas version of the Sears catalog in the mail, and my brother and I would sit down with a pen and we'd circle all the things that we wanted for Christmas. Now, that is something that has impacted my family and has probably impacted other people's families with Sears, and I'm sure that the Eaton's catalog has a similar impact upon the people who receive the catalogs. Now, that might seem like a minor or insignificant thing, but culturally, that was a big thing. It's similar to now you adding something that you want into your Amazon shopping cart or your wish list. That's what it was like back then. And that's a shared experience that many people who received these catalogs had. So, why is it important to discuss Eaton's? Well, Eaton's changed the way that people viewed shopping, and it changed their experience with shopping. In fact, it has impacted the way that we shop today. And that's why I think it's important to discuss Eaton's. As always, thank you for joining us today and learning a little bit about Eaton's. And be sure to come check out the Whitewood Historical Museum.